What is happening, everybody? Thank you for those of you who are returning. Definitely much love, much appreciation. This is the CFB Whisper Show. I'm your host, Cameron Rodriguez. For those of you who don't know, you can just call me Cam. Let's just start to get a little bit more familiar with that. I understand that I'm not on ESPN and all of these things. It doesn't really matter. I'm doing this show for the people and my pure enjoyment in terms of college football. I am definitely a college football connoisseur, so you want to make sure you tune into this. And of course, I want that engagement, right? So share it. Of course, let me know your thoughts. Give me some content ideas. I want to do this for you all. I'm constantly, at least religiously, watching the game, so I'm ready to discuss it. Let me know what your thoughts are. But I am extremely sorry. I want to first off start with I was unable to upload a video last week. Obviously went on a family vacation, then you had the hurricane, and there was just a plethora of reasons. I don't want to give you guys excuses because I really appreciate the constant support. And so with that said, if that happens again, I'll make sure to do exactly what I'm doing now, and that's eating crow. But let's just really dive on into this. But before I do that too, if you are a first-time viewer, it literally costs you 0 cents. Just go down there, like, subscribe, share it with your friends. It doesn't really matter. I am just doing this for fun. And as I continue to grow and get larger, I will make sure to return this favor. So at this moment, don't have any sponsorships like I mentioned. And I really don't care for that stuff at this very moment. I'm doing this based off pure enjoyment. And I really just want to bring you guys incredible content, specifically for the people, specifically for the college football connoisseur. Now, if you have tuned into the show, you understand what's the play. That is a segment that I have essentially launched from the very beginning. What that means is I like to give you all, as a viewer, a first-hand perspective as to what it is we're going to be discussing, and of course, what's on the docket. And what's on the docket for today's show is not really recapping all of Week 8. We will recap several things, as you can see here on the screen. We are going to be recapping specifically the Tennessee and Alabama game, and then, of course, what did he just say? That's going to be something new that we're actually going to be rolling out, because that's something really important. If you actually listen to what these coaches are saying, pre-game, post-game, it kind of gives you an idea as to how the game is going to play out and then whether that met their expectations or not. And then, of course, we will transition into the Florida and Kentucky game, and I'm sure a lot of you are probably like, why in the hell are you guys going to be discussing the Florida and Kentucky game? Why? Well, I can tell you, because there is one team that's doing this. There's another team that's doing this. I'm sure it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out which team is doing which but I don't know, man. November, it might be that gauntlet for Florida. You know, they obviously have to play Georgia, then they got Texas, then they have Ole Miss, then they have Florida State, but they are headed in the right direction, and I want to make sure I emphasize my thoughts on that. And so we'll be diving into that, and of course we'll be diving into the additional segment that I am releasing. And what did he just say? And that is in relation to that game as well. So to conclude the show, we will be going over the power rankings. And what I mean by that is the CFB show power ranking exclusive. This isn't the AP poll. It's not the coaches poll. It's not the committee. This is a exclusive. Mine is done a little bit different. It's not in terms of head-to-heads. It's not in terms of strength of schedule. It's more so in relation to who has the best wins thus far. We are 8 weeks into the season. That's obviously going to change. So a lot of you are going to have some agreement, and most of you are obviously going to have disagreement. Excited to hear what your all's thoughts are. So seriously, let those comments roll in. That's exactly what keeps me motivated to do this. But without further ado, super excited, obviously, bring all of this to you. And let's just really get after it, man. Let's just have some fun with it. Let's kick it.
This is a program that's not accustomed to losing a couple games at this point in the season, players that are not accustomed to it. What's your message to them coming out of something like this that frankly they're just not used to?
Yeah, I mean, I told them in there, I mean, these are the speeches I'm not good at, you know, and, you know, there's inward, you know, that you got to look inward first and make sure, you know, that everything you're doing is right, and then, you know, anyone that you sense that that has any type of questioning, you got to make sure you bring them with. And the thing I know that with our guys, there's enough that know exactly what you're talking about to where it eats at them, and we got to continue to mesh the vets with the new guys, the ones that need to continue to understand what this program stands for and what it's all about.
So check me out. What did we just listen to? This guy, supposedly the guru of a successor coming in, following in from Nick Saban, that legacy that he had left behind. Like, first of all, I don't really know if there's a coach, at least to my knowledge at this moment, who can come in and replace what Nick Saban's done. Nick Saban's had success everywhere he's been. Of course, Kalen DeBoer's obviously had success everywhere he's been as well. But Kalen DeBoer's not familiar with SEC football. Let's just be real. Let's just be honest about this. So I actually find it comical because he's coming in and he's saying, okay, so these younger players, they're not accustomed to the tradition. Bro, listen, they are accustomed to winning football in general. A lot of these players that go to Alabama are accustomed to winning altogether. They are 4, 5-star recruits coming out of high school. They're big fish in small ponds. And in some cases, they're just big fish in big ponds. They want to win games. That's the reason why they went to Alabama. Let's just be real about that. Let's just be real. It really does come down to coaching. It comes down to putting your players in a position to actually win the game. And the only thing I see with Alabama, to be real, is Williams, Jalen Milroe. Extremely predictable. I don't know, man. This is really unprofessional of me to really take these pauses to break this down. But here's my deal with Alabama. We're not used to seeing an Alabama defense be what we've seen thus far. I'm used to seeing Alabama defenses be in your face. I'm used to seeing Alabama defenses just dominating the pass rush, the rush in general. Like, you cannot move the ball on Alabama. That's just what I'm accustomed to seeing. That's been like 15, 20, 30 years. Like, let's just be honest. It was even prehistoric Nick Saban days. That's just the way Alabama football has always been, dating all the way back, even prehistoric early 90s and before. That's just how it's been. Nick Saban didn't come in and all of a sudden just change Alabama football. Yes, they went through a slump, but then Nick Saban came in and he did his thing, and then all of a sudden he brought Alabama football back to relevancy. That's just the way it is. Now all of a sudden you have Tennessee fans and Heupel and everybody thinking that Tennessee is on their way back, when in reality, Tennessee's not a good team. They're just not a good team. They have a good defense. They're just not a good team. Now, that's not saying that Nico can't take that next step, because I do believe Nico can take that next step. As you can see on the screen, he's passed for over 1,400 yards. He has 8 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, but he has a QBR rating of 59.5. Now, he is a redshirt freshman. He sat behind Joe Milton last year. I personally thought that Nico Iamaleava was going to be further along within his development than he is now. It's almost like I'm watching a better version of Joe Milton. Slightly. Un poquito, right? Like, very little. He's honestly not really that much better. It's really bringing me the thought of questioning whether or not Nico is actually being developed the way that he needs to be developed under Heupel. Now, do I think Heupel has the brain to obviously put together some plays, create some mismatches, and put his players in a good position? Yeah, obviously. Nico's obviously also not holding his end of the bargain. If you look at this Alabama game, I believe he had, 4 to 5 passes that were overthrown. That could have easily separated this game from the very get-go in the first half perspective. Like, that's just the way that works. But here's my thought on Nico and this Tennessee team. Yo, your luck. And I don't want to sound like a hater. I don't want to sound like I'm anti-Tennessee, because this is a college football podcast. This is a college football show. Tennessee is not a good football program in terms of their offense. They are a good football program. They're recruiting at an extremely high level right now. Now, granted, they have to put pen to paper. So we're going to see how that folds. Anyways, Kalen DeBoer is legitimately above his head right now. He didn't understand what SEC football is. Well, guess what, bro? You are here now. You are here now. You got a rude awakening. You thought, hey, I coached at Washington, and I've been to other venues where the crowd is extremely loud. I don't think Neyland Stadium is going to be a big deal. If you don't know what I'm referring to, then why don't you catch his pregame coaching conference that happened on Monday, the week before the game? Man. I hate to think that I'm giving Tennessee a ton of credit because really in reality, let's just be real about this. I am not a fan of any specific team. I'm a realist. I will spit it how I see it. And that's what I want people who are viewing this show to understand where I'm coming from. I'm looking at Alabama and I'm thinking, I do not expect you to be a Nick Saban team. Hell, as a matter of fact, even though Nick Saban and that Alabama team made it to the playoffs last year, they were still not the traditional Alabama team I'm used to seeing. And for those of you who don't agree, go ahead and let me know your thoughts. Let me know. But the reality is that's actually a fact. Alabama is dominant on the defensive side of the football. Alabama is dominant in terms of both lines of scrimmage and actually running the ball. They are the type of team that is going to say, hey, I'm going to run the ball until you force me to not run the ball. Now, granted, you have quarterbacks in the last 5 years, 6, 7, 8 years that have been accustomed to actually creating those mismatches and holding the defense accountable. And so they can actually hit those passes. They can actually step up to the plate when that happens. But then you have Jalen Milroe, who's just an extremely dynamic player. But that offensive line, that defensive line, it's not what I'm used to seeing. I think you guys would agree with that. So all in all, let's just be real about this. Alabama's not a good team. Alabama was lucky to even be in this game, considering I do agree if Nico actually did connect on 3, 4, 5 of those passes that he overthrown, this game could have been lopsided, and that's just the reality of that. But guess what? That's the reason why we play the damn game. That's the reason why we play the game. Now, when I think about Tennessee, that defense is actually pretty good. But guess what? If I'm a defensive player and I'm a defensive coordinator, I am in your face in terms of being in the face of the offensive side of the ball. We cannot hold this together for much longer. When the game actually matters, when are we going to actually be a complete unit? When? Because the luck is going to run out. I actually read an article earlier today with Steve Spurrier. He was speaking to the 1010XL channel and the Gator Tells. I don't know if you all keep up with that, but he obviously is not a fan of Tennessee. He grew up in Johnson City. He wanted to be recruited by Tennessee. He wasn't. Then he ended up going to Florida. And not only did he go to Florida, he won a Heisman Trophy at Florida. Then he ends up going and winning a national championship at Florida. He produced another Heisman Trophy winner. Of course, we're going to talk about Florida here more in a moment. But what he was saying in this article was actually legit. The luck is going to run out. Now, is Nico going to step up to the plate? Now, for those of you who have actually watched a lot of my videos, you would know that earlier on, I said when they went to go to Norman, Oklahoma, I said, is Nico capable of putting this team on his back and actually winning a game if it called for it? Guess what? The game didn't call for it in Norman, but he wasn't capable of doing it either. And that was proven in the Arkansas game. I do not want to look at this as a one-trick pony. Okay, this is the SEC. We have the NIL. We have the transfer portal. The level of playing field altogether has just been more equal and et cetera. And all of a sudden you have Tennessee fans that are just extremely ecstatic because they believe they have the right guy. Now, I'm not saying Heupel's not the right guy. But what I do believe is that Heupel doesn't trust Nico. That's pretty apparent. And if you're a Tennessee fan, at least a legitimate Tennessee fan, I think you would agree with me. let's think about this too. If you didn't have Samson on that team, because it's not like the offensive line for Tennessee is actually doing incredible things. It's not like they're actually opening up massive holes that 18-wheelers can run through. Samson is just an animal. He's a difference maker. You hand the ball to him, you allow the offense to actually open up in the way that you want it to open up, which is what we assumed that was actually the case when it comes to a high ball offense anyways. You utilize the run to open up the pass. And then it's almost as if Heupel forgets about that for the majority of the games that he's playing in. And then all of a sudden he puts all of this pressure on Nico. Nico ends up making these mistakes. That offensive line's not protecting him. I mean, Nico is getting absolutely demolished. There's a reason why he got hurt and then he came back. Who the fuck does Tennessee have behind Nico? Excuse my language. I have to spit it how I see it. Who? I mean, the backup comes in and immediately does nothing. He throws one or two plays, hands the ball off, and then all of a sudden Nico comes back. Is because Tennessee doesn't have anybody. That's a fact. Tennessee has people in terms of like the recruiting cycle. They have the number one, or I don't want to say he's the number one, but he's at least a 5-star quarterback coming out of the next year's recruiting cycle. So at least they'll have some depth at that point if he ends up actually putting ink to paper. But the reality is that the only reason why Tennessee is winning a lot of the games is based off sheer luck. And I don't want to upset Tennessee fans because, again, this is a college football podcast. I mean, I support everybody, but I, again, am going to spit it how I see it. Tennessee is skating by sheer luck. To be real, they should have actually had a massive lead against Alabama going into halftime, and then obviously this game shouldn't have been close. But if you are a realistic Tennessee fan, you also know that Florida game, y'all should have lost that game. That game shouldn't have been close. You know that game was 21-24, and other than that Pierce fumble where he forced Mertz to actually fumble it on the 1-yard line, that's the only thing Tennessee did to actually say, hey, look, that was one thing that we did positively. And I'm not saying negatively, towards the end of the game, Tennessee's defense ended up showing up towards the end of that game when it mattered the most. But to reiterate, that shouldn't have been the case. If you're a Tennessee fan, you're puckered in your butthole right now because you know that game should have been out of reach by halftime. It was a ton of coaching errors by Billy Napier and that coaching staff that actually kept Tennessee in that game. I guess what I'm saying is I'm curious how much longer this luck for Tennessee actually stays where it's at. Very curious. Not really sure if that's going to continue, especially when the games start to matter the most. But for now, I understand all that matters is +1 on the scoreboard at the end of the day, and Tennessee's obviously finding a way. And guess what? They're 6-1. They beat Alabama. They beat Florida. That is what it is. I don't have any hard feelings towards any of that. But I don't want the narrative for this Tennessee football team to be that they are this incredible team when in reality they have a lot to work on. Now, in terms of Alabama has much more to work on. So much more to work on. I can talk about Alabama all day, to be real, but Alabama is just simply not a good football team. Defensively, both lines of scrimmage, even though they were causing havoc on Nico all day, this game is just one of those games that it just happened to be where it falls in Tennessee's favor. I just can't say it would be the same case if it was in Alabama. I've seen how Nico's performed on the road. Now, granted, a lot of these games don't come down to how Nico performs because he's obviously, in my opinion, average to below average at this point. He needs some severe development. But I've seen him how he performs on the road, and NC State wasn't a good sign. Just wasn't. Nico, what did he throw? 2 interceptions in that game. And then in the Florida game, he threw 1 interception. Now, granted, that was a good play by the defense in Florida because they obviously dropped back into a zone coverage when he thought they were in man initially. And if you don't know your differences in terms of schemes, then you know what I'm talking about because they did that. It was a great disguise, and they caught him off guard. He did his thing. He did a pre-snap read. He knew exactly where he was going before the play even snapped, and then he decided to not actually go through his reads, and he stayed strong with the decision he made before that. Now, granted, I don't want to talk about this Tennessee-Florida game because we're talking about Tennessee-Alabama right now, but at the end of the day, Tennessee should have 2 losses if it wasn't for a coaching breakdown at Florida, which is arguably the reason why Billy Napier's on his way out. It's not because he can't recruit well. It's not because they don't have talent. It's not because they don't have any of the athletes. I don't know if y'all watched the same game with that Tennessee-Florida game, but it looked like Florida was completely outplaying Tennessee. It looked like Florida had much better athletes. It looked like Florida had a much better scheme. Now, I know this isn't going to sit well with a lot of you Tennessee fans because you guys are used to seeing or at least thinking that you have the better team, and that's okay, and y'all end up always finding a way to lose. But in this case, you found a way to win, and that's awesome. Good for you all. You guys are sitting at 6-1 with a 35% chance of actually hitting or at least making the college football playoffs. Like, that's incredible. But if Nico doesn't make any more improvement, at least a significant improvement in my mind, how much longer will this take? Because his defense can't hold up. You go against a team that's actually going to play complete football, offense, defense, special teams. What's going to happen with Tennessee if you guys can't produce any points? This defense is eventually going to fold. And if it doesn't, good for you. Because part of the game is sheer luck. And that's what's been happening, in my opinion, in terms of the Tennessee program so far this year. When is it going to run out? Maybe it runs out before the season actually ends, and then all of a sudden you guys figure things out before you go into the playoffs. That's best case scenario. But in my opinion, it's just hard to tell because I don't think that Nico's being developed. I don't think Nico actually understands the speed of the game, and that's pretty evident. And unless Heupel all of a sudden decides to actually roll him out and utilize him in the run game, get him more comfortable, do those quick to short intermediate passes, I don't think that Tennessee's going to make it far. I actually think that there are a couple of more losses on this team, on this record at this moment than a lot of Tennessee fans want to anticipate. Now, here's another thing, and I'm going to leave it at this, and then we're going to move on. I don't think beating Alabama is something to celebrate. Alabama just lost to Vanderbilt. Now, I'm not saying Vanderbilt's a bad team because obviously they got things clicking over there and they're doing what they got to do. But guess what? Vanderbilt's playing complete football. They're playing football on offense, defense, special teams. They're doing their thing. Now, here's the reality of Tennessee football, in my opinion. Is it going to click soon? Because if it doesn't, I would hate to see all these Tennessee fans be as hyped as they are at this very moment. And then all of a sudden, when it comes down to something that actually has some sort of implication on the line, whether that be an SEC championship, say they make it, by sheer luck again, because the defense is obviously able to get them there, but that offense isn't going to get them over the hump. If it happens in the playoffs, they might just lose in the first round. Honestly, I have several teams that could legitimately put Tennessee down if Heupel and this offense don't get things clicking soon. Now, I know it sounds like that I'm putting Tennessee down in a lot of ways, but at the end of the day, like Tennessee is just, they're scaping by. +1. Great defense, no offense. Is that sustainable? I guess we'll see. That's just the reality of that. So, Alabama, I don't know, man. DeBoer might be above his head. I mean, I'm scratching my own head right now in terms of Alabama. I really don't care what Alabama looks like at this very moment. They've been so dominant for so long that if they find a way to win, that's just typical Alabama. And I do believe that they'll find their way. They still have a, 32% chance of actually making the playoffs despite having 2 losses. So we'll see what happens with that. But they also have to play LSU. They have to play Auburn. It doesn't really matter what Auburn's record is at the end of the day. We all know that that's always a good game. And for some reason, Hugh Freeze always has Alabama's number. Now, that was when Nick Saban was there. I don't know if that's going to be the case with DeBoer, but I can tell you that at the end of the day, that's just a rivalry that you just can't ignore. And DeBoer is not proven to show up in the games that matter in terms of rivalries. Just look at this game, and then obviously dropping a game to Vanderbilt. Yeah, he beat Georgia, but I think if you play that game 9 times out of 10 against Georgia, especially on a neutral site field, I don't think Alabama comes away with even half of those. I don't think Alabama comes away with 3 or 4 of those games based off how they played lately. So there's a lot that goes into this Tennessee team that I'm going to need to see in order for me to actually buy into it. I was a big proponent for this Tennessee squad earlier in the year. That defense was absolutely incredible. I thought Nico would probably develop a little bit more as the season continued, but it looks like he's staying mid to average or slightly below average in my opinion, and I just don't think that that's sustainable. So we'll see what happens as the year continues to progress. Tennessee obviously has a little bit of a lighter schedule. They do have to play Kentucky, which Kentucky does have the number 3 team in terms of overall defense in the country. So we'll see what happens with that. And Alabama's not even close to that. I'm curious. Now, granted, don't get it twisted because you might think, okay, Florida beat Kentucky this past weekend 48-20, and all of a sudden because Tennessee beat Florida, all of a sudden you think that you can beat Kentucky in the same way, but that game was at home. I don't really know. I got to double check. I got to see where this game's at. Is Tennessee playing Kentucky in Kentucky, or are they playing, Kentucky at home? I don't know, but there's a lot that's going to weigh on that. Now, granted, Nico did say at the beginning of the year that he would much rather play an away game because he just likes that competitive atmosphere and he likes to essentially send the fans home sad because that's just how that goes. And if you don't know what I'm referring to, then you're obviously not following Tennessee football. But Nico hasn't really performed well, not just on the road, but even at home. So a lot of it's going to depend on what is this coaching staff going to do to get him more comfortable earlier on in the game. Because if they don't get him more comfortable earlier on in the game and then all of a sudden the game starts to progress and Tennessee is, either it's a close game or they're just behind altogether, you cannot obviously, thus, at least until this point, put the game on Nico's shoulder. Maybe he'll connect on 1 or 2 of those passes that he's overthrown in several of these past games, and that might be the difference. But can you really rely on that? That's really all I got to say on this Tennessee-Alabama game. I don't think either team is really good, to be honest. I think Tennessee's surviving based off sheer luck. I do think that defense is good. I don't think the offense is good at all. I think Samson is the only reason why a lot of the time this team is even staying in the game, and that's because they decide to make that transition or that adjustment at halftime. Why don't you just fucking start the game with that? Why don't you actually just hand the ball to Samson every single time and then get Nico comfortable and roll him out and then actually do those short to intermediate passes and not always go for the explosive play? Because you're making Nico look like a terrible quarterback and you're also not developing him and coaching him at the right time. There's so many things I have in my brain, and I could continue to go on for days, but we're going to move on. Obviously, Tennessee ended up beating Alabama 24-17, so there you have it. Tennessee's obviously sitting at a 6-1 record. Alabama's sitting at 5-2. We'll see what happens. I do think that Alabama has a little bit of a harder schedule, to conclude, the season. Tennessee has slightly an easier schedule to conclude the season. Tennessee might actually find themselves into the playoffs, but in my opinion, based off what I've seen, even if they found themselves into the playoffs, I don't think they're going to get far because if that offense doesn't take the next step and that quarterback doesn't get a little bit more comfortable and there's no development there, Tennessee might be in trouble. They might actually find themselves out first round because we all know that they're not going to make it to the SEC championship game despite what this record says. Texas A&M's actually undefeated right now. You have Texas, who's only one loss to Georgia, and then you have other teams in general that I just think at this moment are playing better football. So we'll kind of circle back to this. I do think that there are some discussions. If you haven't seen my video in terms of me comparing Nico Yamaliava to DJ Lagway, I think you should probably take another visit to that one because, yeah, the stats might be comparable, but I do think DJ Lagway is much further ahead from a maturity perspective and just being able to drop dimes into the basket. Just look at it. Hell, he had 7 completions, and we'll talk about that here in a moment, that were over 40 yards in the basket. You couldn't have been any better than just handing it off to him. So there's just so much that I want to talk about this game. Man, I know Tennessee fans are super hyped. Good for you all. You all are +1 on the scoreboard. So we'll see what happens from that point on. But I appreciate you guys obviously tuning into this.